This is Translators Aloud, and I'm going to read from a novel called Erindring om Kærlighed, written by Kirsten Thorup, provisionally entitled in English Recollection of Love. And this is a novel that won the Nordic Council Literature Prize in 2017, I believe. And it hasn't yet been published in English. The rights are still available through Monica Gram at Copenhagen Literary Agency. I'm going to read a couple of pages, 2 or 3 pages from the beginning of the book. This is a chapter or a section entitled, Where Am I From? My father was of the conviction that important documents needed to be kept for posterity. He'd meticulously put away every one of more than 50 annual Christmas cards, birthday greetings and holiday postcards from every member of the family. The weekly letters from my older brother, who was away serving his apprenticeship in Haderslev. In those days, people seldom used the telephone for anything other than local calls. And my own intermittent, illegible letters from abroad. The young person who'd been me must have been seriously troubled. I couldn't see myself in her hopeless scribblings. Had I been under the influence, unable to grasp a biro? There was an unsent letter too from my mother to the 13-year-old me. A despairing letter imploring me to open my mouth and talk to her instead of just shaking or nodding my head whenever she asked me something. What had she done to make me behave in such a way? Was I so fiercely unhappy even then? My mother's diaries from the final years before the war were in the parcel too. A purpose-bought cardboard box wrapped in sturdy brown paper and secured with string tied with elaborate knots. As the family archivist, my father had seen no reason to ask my mother's permission to send me her private observations from their early marriage and my brother's childhoods. She'd have let him do as he pleased with them anyway. I suppose she'd forgotten about them, not only what was in them, but also that they even existed. She'd always lived in the present, cheerfully bobbing along with the silent tick-tock of time. I envied her ethereal ways, her jaunty passage through life, always hovering on the face of the waters as if her true home had been far away from all that was earthly, in shameless contact with the soul of the universe, or perhaps rather with God and all eternity. I, for my part, was in contact with nothing in particular, but drifted restlessly through the walls between the empty rooms of the house when nobody was ever home. I hadn't asked to be made responsible for all these relics of the past, these ringing bells. What was my father trying to tell me? Something he couldn't bring himself to say out loud? And anyway, wasn't my eldest brother first in line to the family documents? I considered reading my mother's diaries. On the other hand, they were from a time before my parents had even imagined me. I was an afterthought, an accident, an embarrassment. In those days, people had children early, and for a woman in her 40s to be pregnant was to inappropriately draw attention to ongoing sexual activity in a marriage that more properly ought to have settled into repose. For a married couple to have children at such a late age was quite exceptional and brought with it unpleasant associations with the lower classes who would never learn to restrain themselves and regardless of age and gender would cavort without a thought for propriety. My mother's pregnancy was kept secret. Not even her sisters knew of her circumstance until the last couple of months. And when her swollen belly could no longer be concealed, my father forbade her to venture outdoors. A messenger boy ran the necessary errands from the grocers and butchers' shops. The whole village already knew of my mother's plight, so the talk was more about the newsagent's peculiar efforts to keep it hidden. Only 2 years before, the electrician's wife had given birth to twins at the age of 42. No one had begrudged them anything, or had they? Had there not been whispers and gossip and cheap laughs behind the poor man's back? Had his apparent prowess not been a source of mirth that summer? My mother was a year older than the electrician's wife, and my father just turned 48. They could just as well have put them in stocks in the high street. From childhood, I was my mother's domestic until I started lower secondary and began to rebel, refusing to scrub floors and clean windows, chop parsley and dice onions. I was her kitchen help, chopping and dicing. My mother cooked and baked. She made such lovely food, but did not initiate me in the culinary skills. My mother had been a domestic herself, to begin with for her father on their little smallholding following the death of her mother when she was just 13 years old. Subsequently, at a larger farm some distance from home. Now she was copying the housewives in whose employment she'd served before marrying my father, stepping into the role of lady of the house and making me into a younger version of herself. The role of domestic was the only one my mother knew and could pass on to me. Even before I started school, my parents had false teeth, greying hair, salt and pepper, and bifocals. To the other children, I was an object of pity. It's a shame your parents are so old. I tried to make them believe they in fact were my grandparents, though without success. The histories of the various households and families would be recounted in detail and exhaustively during the long evenings of winter when knitting and needlework required a solid accompaniment of gossip, unlike card games, whose peculiar tensions made them self-contained. I had little difficulty of my own convincing myself that my mother and father were my grandparents. And as the years passed, I became a teenager, an English expression that had entered the language and which my mother couldn't abide, partly because she found it hard to pronounce, partly because it gave young people an inappropriate sense of their own importance. Their behaviour seemed to me increasingly backward. My mother could say, for instance, that if I should accidentally become pregnant, then under no circumstance was I to give the child up for adoption or a place in a children's home. Instead, I was to bring it home with me immediately and leave it to her to look after. I hated her for tramping about my private life in her great big muddy wellies, and the fact that she could even suggest the possibility of my having a sex life at the age of 13 was something I found both abhorrent and vulgar. I never quite knew what my mother would say next and began to avoid her accordingly. I disliked her intensely. Her physical presence made me unwell. I couldn't bear being close to her. Even her slightest attempt to stroke my hair or pat me on the cheek was enough to turn me away from her. The distance between us was something I tried, usually unsuccessfully, to bridge by means of provocation. For instance, I once asked my mother how women masturbated. Without batting an eyelid, she replied calmly and with the utmost detachment that I could use a lump of dough or a half-cooked carrot. But no sooner had she embarked upon more detailed instructions to the use of such paraphernalia than I swiftly withdrew from the kitchen, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't win over my mother. She was made of sterner stuff, of spiders' webs, the spittle of a bird, the sound of a cat's footfall. Later, I wondered if the use of dough and carrots was something she'd gleaned from the other domestics on the farms. I was always looking for something that would explain my mother to me. I couldn't understand why the strictly enforced norms and rules of the village didn't apply to her. Or was it only with me that she let herself go and allowed the person she was to shine through? Perhaps I was my mother's only friend and confidant. When after gymnasium school I went to live in London to study drama in the daytime and work behind a bar in the evenings, she wasted away and became a shadow of herself. She was afraid of all things foreign and terrified for me, outlining all kinds of calamities that could befall me. It was no good that I tried to put her mind at rest by telling her I spoke the language and hadn't the slightest difficulty coping with my drama courses and my part-time job. I hadn't been allowed to stay on at school longer than my brothers just to move to a foreign country, she complained. It was so I could take on the job of village school teacher and realise an ambition of hers that had proved beyond her reach. My mother was a frequent correspondent, But during the year I was away, I received not a single letter from her. There was no more ink in her pen, she claimed cryptically, and she no longer understood people, in other words, me. However, I did receive a rather formal letter from my father, informing me briefly that she'd been admitted to the psychiatric hospital and that my long absence was a contributory factor. I pictured her diminutive, short-waisted figure, perpetually clad in barrel-shaped dresses, short sleeves and bright colours in summer, long sleeves and dark colours in winter, always the same design made for her by the village seamstress. And I imagined her breakdown, how she'd lain down on the pavement outside the shop and had to be taken away by an ambulance. Perhaps it was a desperate attempt to call me home. I was familiar with her shabby tricks whenever she felt threatened, the dark and disheartened aspect she carried inside her, concealed by the light that she gave out. She balanced her life on the dividing line between good and bad, angels on the one side, devils on the other. How had she been able to survive in that battle zone of the spirits and at the same time proceed so light-heartedly through existence? She thrived on dinner parties, functions and coffee mornings with the ladies of the village, of whom a small number were what we today would call friends. Was her inner world that much deeper than her outward demeanour suggested? Was her enormous social appetite, her tireless work in the home and in my father's shop, no more than a sham?